How did you come to serve in the military?
I was born and raised in Boston, Mass, in the projects, in the city. So there wasn't much for job prospects back then in the early 70s. And you listen to recruiters and they talk about, touring around the world and we'll feed you and clothe you and all that nice stuff. And I said, hey, sounds good. Job opportunity, here I come.
How old were you when you joined?
Well, at that time I was 17 and a half when I graduated. If you're under 18, you have to get the parents' permission. So I had my parents sign the paperwork and off I went into the Air Force.
So you volunteered and you didn't get drafted?
Right, because at that time they did have a draft going on and everything else, but usually people would get their cards between 17 and a half and 18. But because I just hit that period, I already volunteered and signed the paperwork and everything else, so I never got a draft card.
Since the topic is Vietnam, were you ever stationed in or near?
Actually, I was. It was my third assignment, and I volunteered. At that time, I was stationed in Colorado, and I volunteered for Vietnam. But Vietnam was winding down at the time, so they sent me to the nearest base, which was Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. And I remember that when I first got there, the first 3 months I was there, it was 12, 14-hour shifts. We were bringing the Vietnamese people in from Saigon as it was falling, flying them back and forth, empty the planes and then fly back and pick up a lot more people. A lot more. In the beginning, it was women and children. And usually the military puts a name to the operation. So at that time it was called Operation Baby Lift. And that's what we were involved in.
When you had time off, what did you typically do to relax and unwind?
Well, whenever there is a situation, a crisis or a war or whatever, usually you work 7 days a week, 12 to 14-hour shifts of on, and then enough time, 10 hours to sleep before you have to go back. And at that time, you fill in wherever you're needed. So I was in a C-130 squadron. So as an additional crew member for the unit, I didn't have to go flying with them. So what I did was I volunteered to help set up tents for the Vietnamese people and play games with them, keep them occupied, teach them how to, speak English and things like that. So it made the day go by fast, and it was my way of serving, so to speak.
Did you hear about the things that happened at home while you were away?
Well, if you meant the riots and the things like that, the peace marches and things like that, we'd hear bits and pieces of it. But, when you're overseas, especially in a foreign country where they don't speak English or speak very little English, then you're only able to read the Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, which is always slanted in favor of the military, or you're always watching one channel on TV that's set up for the military to watch. And again, kind of slanted. We'd get more information if there were disasters at home and things like that, but we wouldn't get hardly any information about the peace marches and things like that. We'd hear something about it, and a lot of times it used to be the people that were coming over, the new people coming over to Clark.
What did it feel like to be there and part of the war?
Well, it depends on what you were doing. It depends on the job you had and what role you played. If you were in country means in Vietnam, then it was crazy because, you know, I mean, you had to patrol the jungle. A lot of times someone's always shooting at you, things like that. You hear all kinds of stories on both sides, and there's some truth to both stories. But in general, if you're out of country, all you do is you support the effort, you know, whether it's from the States or whether it's from the base you're stationed at, the military effort, because that's who you're working for.
What did it feel like to be there and part of the war? And did you support the war in Vietnam?
Very good question. Because what I know now, if I'd known it back then, is a different story. Because even when I went to college classes afterwards, and one of the history classes I took was on the Vietnam War, I learned a lot more about the war, where the U.S. had an opportunity to not be in a conflict. And the powers to be in government said, no. So they chose the path we were on. And rightfully so, when the people were protesting and things like that, they were protesting for a positive reason, you know, because we didn't have to be there, you know, based on what I know now. You know, so to say I would support it or not, if I went back, I would be doing the same thing I was doing, you know. I got to do something good. And see, because I wasn't in country, what I was doing was more positive. See, and to me, that meant more than either going, you know, in country and maybe, you know, hurting people or being back home. And I guess that the flip side of the coin too is because we never really understood why we, the protesters at home, harmed us. Like I got spit on in the airport when I got into San Francisco. We're just doing what we're supposed to do. Well, we have a contract for doing a job. You know, they were doing the right thing by protesting, but it should be government and not us because we have no say-so in the matter.
How did you feel about the anti-war movement?
I thought they were fine, as long as they focused on government and, you know, questioned government as to why we were there, what was the purpose, what was the outcome. Because what we heard was, you know, we wanted to reunite North and South. Well, I never seen it in the whole time I knew. But you see how they reunited after the end of the war.
In your opinion, what was the hardest part of being away in that war?
When you go off to war, I mean, that's just part of the responsibility, part of the duty, part of what you signed up for. A lot of times, as long as you have a good partner at home, they take care of the kids, they take care of the bills, they take care of all that stuff. So you don't have to worry about those. So, and you can't worry about stuff like that when you're, you know, in war. So it was fine being over there, focusing on the duties, you know, being positive, trying to be more proactive and productive, you know, towards the responsibilities of the duties you had to do.
Are you proud that you decided to join the war?
In my little spot, yes. Yes, I got to make a positive difference in people that had nothing. I guess the biggest thing was in what I did, what I was a part of, was comforting people that lost everything. And to me, that was the most important part. I would do it all for me. So.
How, if all, do you think your involvement in the war has affected the person that you've become since the war?
I guess I would have to tell the story, the caveat that I brought up. I volunteered to help the Vietnamese people when they came over to the PI, the Philippines, before they left to go to the States or Europe or things like that. I got to be a positive influence. And when you do that out of the kindness of your heart, it's like paying it forward. Who would have known that 20 years later, after the war, now here it is, I settle down in Washington. I go into the computer field. I'm going to learn everything about computers. I'm going to get a job at Microsoft, and I want to work for them. And wouldn't you know it, that's what happened. And my first boss was a Vietnamese lady. And when I found out that she wasn't born and raised in the States, that she actually was born in Vietnam but had to leave, then I went, uh-oh. So I got the courage to sit down with her one time, and say, okay, let me ask you something personal, can I? And then I asked, okay, how did you get to the States here? I heard you had to leave Vietnam. And she talked about flying over to somewhere else, and then eventually coming to the States. And she came directly to Washington, and the family adopted her, and she went to Washington State and went into computers, and she was working at Microsoft, and all of a sudden that's my first boss. True story. So you never know how it all comes around. I don't know. I enjoyed my military service. I did more positive than anything else. That's what you have to strive for. Not all of us are killers. Shoot people down, run them over with the tanks. Some of us have a 9-to-5 job sometimes, Sometimes we're called to go out to another country and work over there. That's the nature of the business. But I wouldn't take anything back.